With their emergence, you had the intensification of violence in the Middle East and a string of terror attacks in the West. Many said that ISIS surpassed even al-Qaeda as the most prominent terror threat. In response, over 120 Muslim scholars signed the open letter to al-Baghdadi, which was a clear rejection of ISIS ideology. The letter forbade issuing fatwas without scholarship, ignoring context, killing civilians, mistreating minorities including Yazidis, reintroducing slavery, and more. This particular document was reported on somewhat by the media, though the public debate on Islam and violence continued.
The key thing to recognize that I don't think is part of the argument, but I think should be, is that there are voices that are oftentimes raised in opposition to these jihadists and to these extreme acts. But guess what? They don't get covered. They don't get exposed. And they're not given the same level of platform that we see the jihadists
One reason
get.
they don't get exposed is because they're afraid to speak out.
But you also have other braver souls out there who do speak out and who who
are risking their lives to do that.
Like the Muslim clerics and others from Australia to Europe to the United States just recently publicly put their names on paper declaring their opposition to what ISIS and others are doing. So there are those voices, but where was the coverage? Where was that story to sort of create a different picture?
A similar statement was made around the same time by Abdullah Bin Bayyah after a meeting of the Forum for Promoting Peace in Muslim Societies in March, when over 250 scholars and thinkers met in order to discuss the problem of ongoing violence in the Muslim world. Sheikh Bin Bayyah also released a video to accompany this.
طريق سفك الدماء المتبادل ليست طريقا صحيحا. على هؤلاء الشباب أن يعودوا إلى الحقائق، أن ينظروا إلى الحقيقة وأن يراجعوا أنفسهم مراجعة صادقة وأن يتقوا الله سبحانه وتعالى ويعمروا المساجد ويعالج الناس في المستشفيات ويسدوا الخير إلى الفقراء. هذا هو الطريق.
One of Sheikh Bin Bayyah's most notable students is the American scholar Hamza Yusuf, who gave a now well-known sermon entitled The Crisis of ISIS, where he echoed similar statements.
I put something out on the web called The Crisis of ISIS, and it went viral in the Middle East. I think a lot of people saw it. It was translated into Arabic, and I think it just bothered them. It was a little swat to the hornet's nest.
And you really took them on. You argued that they have a flimsy ideology.
My argument was that they don't really have legitimacy in terms of Islamic tradition. Every religion creates sex. It's a natural outcome of any revelation. Christianity has plenty of sex. The KKK see themselves, they swear an oath on the Bible. The man who assassinated Rabin doesn't represent Judaism, although he was a rabbinical student, justifying his actions through Torah and Talmudic tradition. So I think religion goes wrong, and it's very important for voices out there to direct people to the normative tradition. In other words, the mainstream tradition, what the religion and those who understand it best have articulated about it. In Islam, you're looking at 1.3 billion people that the vast majority, the overwhelming majority, have nothing to do with violence. There was a book called Are Muslims Distinctive by a social scientist from UC Berkeley, not a Muslim, who wrote this book arguing that in fact stable Muslim societies were less violent than stable Western societies. And that's been my experience. I lived over 10 years in the Muslim world, and I found that Muslims by and large are not violent at all.
It's worth mentioning that Yusuf also founded Zaytuna College, an Islamic college in California which aims to produce scholars capable of countering the ISIS narrative. Later in 2015, he gave an interview where he commented on how negligent the media is when it comes to covering learned Muslim scholars. As he said, "I've been to so many conferences condemning this stuff. The media ignores us. There are books written on this." Doesn't seem like he was wrong. In response to Graham Wood's now infamous article on ISIS, journalist Mehdi Hassan interviewed British scholar Abdul Murad, who mentioned the consensus of Muslim scholars on this point. Islam has its leadership, its universities, its muftis, and its academies, which unanimously repudiate ISIS. In response to the killing of Christians and the beheading of aid worker Peter Kasich in 2014, American scholar Zaid Shakir condemned the killing and prohibited watching the execution video. Contrary to the image of our religion being put forward by warmongering murderers, both those who hate Islam and those claiming to be its adherents, Islam is dedicated to helping and assisting the weak and helpless, not using them in sadistic pornographic propaganda films, which, by the way, it is absolutely forbidden to view. Shakir also spoke against the enslavement and rape of Yazidis, and refuted the attempt of ISIS to Islamically justify this. In November 2015, ISIS terrorists killed 130 and injured 413 in Paris. Amidst all the furore, Muslim scholars like Faraz Rabbani and Abdullah Bewley were ignored.
Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made us responsible for protecting the good and standing up to the wrong. كُنْتُمْ خَيْرَ أُمَّةٍ أُخْرِجَتْ لِلنَّاسِ. You are the most virtuous of communities raised unto humanity. Why? تَأْمُرُونَ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ. You call to all that is good. وَتَنْهَوْنَ عَنِ الْمُنْكَرِ. And you forbid all that is wrong. So when we see around us that there's ugliness being spread in the name of our religion, there are travesties and terror being committed in the name of our Prophet, we have to realize that we have a collective responsibility. So instead of sitting and watching the news for hours, say, okay, how can I be a part of change for the good? Are there religious understandings in our community that are ugly, that are affecting our youth and causing them to embrace erroneous ways? There clearly are. Now, we're not responsible for those understandings, have nothing to do with the way of the Messenger of Mercy, but we are responsible.
Once again, I and many other Muslim spokesmen find ourselves having to respond to yet another horrific outrage perpetrated by people who call themselves Muslims. Firstly, I must state unequivocally, as I have on every previous occasion, that these atrocities are as much crimes under Islamic law as they are in the eyes of any other legal system, and punishable by the severest penalties.
Remember the de-radicalized members of the Islamic group in Egypt? Well, in 2016, members Najih Ibrahim and Hisham an-Najjar published ISIS, the knife that slaughters Islam and Muslims. As the title suggests, they don't really like ISIS either. Their critique isn't really dissimilar to what others have said. They also condemn the killing of civilians and pretty much everything else ISIS does. Sherman Jackson gave a lecture summarizing the text. So here's some clips.
Ibrahim's and an-Najjar's critique should give pause to those who tend to look upon Sharia, or what has become known in the West as Sharia law, as invariably contributing to the mentality of ISIS and never fundamentally challenging it. Our authors demonstrate, however, that not only can principal critiques of ISIS come from liberals, secularists, or so-called progressives, they can also come from the pens of bearded men with fundamentalist ties and strong attachments to Sharia. Yes, I think that there are ideological interests that are at play in much of the coverage of, look, you take, how many people have heard about the Jama'at Islamiyya and the renunciation of political violence before tonight? Does that make sense to you? Does that make sense to you? I mean, the largest, most violent jihadi movement in the Muslim world renounces political violence, and we hear nothing about it. Anyone who's aware that he farts up in the mountains of Tora Bora or something like that, and it's international news. But that's why people like myself, yourself, we have to go out there, all right, unearth and present. This is the way it is. Are you going to wait for them to present it for you? good luck.
In a rare display of interest in what learned Muslims had to say, Fox News interviewed Yasir Qadhi, another prominent community figure and Islamic studies professor. During a brief segment, Qadhi took the occasion to condemn ISIS and emphasize Islamic moderation.
Joining us now is religious studies professor at Rhodes College in Memphis, Dr. Yasir Qadhi. Dr. Qadhi, good morning.
Good morning.
Why are you speaking out so forcefully against ISIS?
Well, I think it's the religious duty of every single Muslim when a group is hijacking the faith, when a group is misrepresenting the faith, to clarify to the broader world that that faith has nothing to do with the brutal actions of ISIS. ISIS and its beheadings, its burnings of people, its viciousness does not represent my faith, and I feel obliged, religiously obliged, to speak out. I, along with all other American Muslims, and really Muslims worldwide, I mean, it's our religious duty, and especially with regards to Muslim clerics like myself, I think it's my God-given duty, I think it's my responsibility to speak out against this group. And so as long as I'm alive, I ask God for the courage to speak out against every injustice and brutality, including that of ISIS.
Another notable figure when it comes to condemning ISIS is the Syrian-born Muhammad al-Yaqoubi, a scholar who published Refuting ISIS, a rebuttal of its religious and ideological foundations. Yaqoubi wrote the book partly in the hopes that the media would cover it. By and large, they didn't, despite his urging this. Yaqoubi stated, "I urged the media to spread this fatwa, communicate its contents, and establish seminars on television and radio to discuss the explanations and clarifications provided herein." He also noted the negative role the media can play in spreading negative perceptions of Islam and Muslims. The need for clarity is intensified by the fact that a number of Western media outlets jump at the opportunity to promote a false equivalency between the ideology of ISIS and the position of mainstream Muslims, a prominent example being Fox News. These media outlets have found substantial material in this group's fatwas, stances and crimes to promote a fear of Islam amongst the Western masses in a time where the tide of moderate Islam in the West is rising, as is the number of those entering the faith. It's worth mentioning that most Muslim condemnations refer to terror groups as bad Muslims, but they don't say they've left Islam completely because of their actions. However, scholars like Yaqoubi do. As with previous examples, Yaqoubi's book is full of references to the Islamic tradition in order to support his positions. In essence, Yaqoubi is of the view that, quote, "the declaration of ISIS' caliphate is invalid, ISIS as a group has left Islam, joining ISIS is forbidden, defecting from ISIS is obligatory, fighting ISIS is obligatory until it is defeated." In July 2016, Omar killed 49 and wounded 53 in Orlando. Yet again, Muslim leaders issued a statement condemning the attack, making reference to Muhammad Ali, who had passed away just days before, as a model of Islamic practice, whilst quoting the Quran. Quote, "We, as American Muslims, follow the open-hearted and inclusive Islam of Muhammad Ali and completely reject the hatred, provincialism and intolerance of those who trample upon the rights of others, besmirching and defiling the name of Islam. The criminal, who took the lives of dozens of patrons of the Orlando nightclub and injured many others, was an aggressor, plain and simple. The Quran says, 'Do not be brutal or commit aggression, for surely God does not love brutal aggressors.'" To their credit, CNN actually gave some time to Hamza Yusuf in the wake of the attack, wherein they acknowledged that Muslims had issued many statements condemning terrorism, and questioned the need to issue another. In response, Hamza Yusuf lamented the endless repeated condemnations, despite many still wondering why Muslims didn't speak out. As he put it, "We're trapped in this constant cycle of events, condemnation, events, condemnation. And then people still say, why don't Muslims condemn these things?" So, what was the response of ISIS? Well, in a 2016 edition of their Dabiq magazine, They threatened many of these scholars with death. In an article entitled "The Imams of Disbelief in the West," these people risked their lives to an extent, yet the media still largely ignores them. Those who follow the Muslim community very closely have been frustrated by the lack of clarity on the subject. An example of this is Jonathan Brown, an American Islamic Studies professor who best expressed the futility of even having a debate like this.
And it's not Islamic, is what you're saying. Yeah, actually, this is what's really interesting, is this really kind of, I'd hate to say, this moronic debate that the American public square has been engaged in for over a year now. Is ISIS Islamic? Okay, no Muslim scholars approve what ISIS is doing. None. They condemn their ideology, they condemn their actions. So the idea that somehow all the Muslim scholars in the world, who can't agree on anything, basically, they all agree that ISIS is completely un-Islamic. The fact that we're sitting there saying, oh, is ISIS Islamic or not? I mean, this is really to ignore the global Muslim community. And to say that sort of we as, I don't know, American political analysts or something are actually we're going to agree with ISIS. When ISIS says we're the true Muslims, we're going to agree with them? That's kind of ridiculous if you think about it.
And so here we come to the present day. Of course, I've only offered a sample of the various books, fatwas and organizations against extremism. There are two final sources worth mentioning on this, just to illustrate what I'm talking about. So the first is this page on the American Muslim, run by Sheila Musaji. It's a massive resource featuring various scholars and organizations and their condemnations, only some of which I've covered here. An American Muslim student, Heraa Hashmi, created a 712-page Excel document listing thousands of instances of condemnations. If you have a scroll down and look at the sources, you'll hardly ever come across a mainstream media story. It just goes on and on and on. Now, you might be thinking, what about Taqiyya? So, for those of you who don't know, Taqiyya, according to critics at least, is a doctrine that states that Muslims can deceive non-Muslims until they gain the upper hand over them. Now, one day I'll do a separate video on this altogether, but for now, it's worth referring to scholars Omar Suleiman and Nazir Khan of the Yaqeen Institute. According to them, Taqiyya is only valid when one is in mortal danger, and scholars are unanimous that treachery and the breaking of covenants is prohibited. You might also be thinking, well, that's great, except that despite all this, attacks are still happening, so maybe we need to see something more. Maybe Muslims still aren't doing enough. Now, to that I would say, we also need to look at factors external to the Muslim community and see what's going on there, in particular the media and also the political arena. It's already been mentioned that many well-meaning Muslims condemn terrorism, but they're often not reported on, so the media clearly needs to handle that better. Sometimes they'll even acknowledge the efforts that Muslims make, but then say something to rain on the parade. Back when Gavin McInnes was at Rebel Media, the budget Fox News which passes for journalism nowadays, he interviewed Katie Macfarland, a former advisor to both Reagan and also Trump. Now, Macfarland has had a long career and is presented as a foreign policy expert, so you'd expect she might have something reasonable to say like, well, Muslims have been condemning terrorism for a long time, we have to recognize that and look at other factors as well. But, well, just see for yourself.
So President Sisi of Egypt, I met with him about 2 months ago, and he had just gone to Al-Azhar University, which is like their Vatican, and he had said to the leaders of the Muslim religion, you guys, we have a big problem, and that's radical Islam. We didn't snuff it when we should have, and it's up to you, and it's your responsibility to speak out. About a month later, the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar University, who I also met with a few weeks ago, he went to Mecca and he said to all the senior educators of Islam, of Sunni Islam, he said, we have to change, we have to reform ourselves. So what we have been waiting for 15 years was within the Muslim community, we've always been saying, where are the modern Muslims? Why don't they speak up? Why don't they condemn the violence? They in fact have started to do that.
so they've just now started to do that. Except that they've been doing it for years, way before 2015, that's for sure, as we've already seen. We're also told that terrorism is the sole responsibility of Muslims to fix, and this comes from a person who served in the Reagan administration, which was responsible for Operation Cyclone, where the CIA funded the Mujahideen in Afghanistan during the 80s. I mean, that's ridiculous. Were it not for Operation Cyclone, you likely wouldn't have had groups like the Taliban or Al-Qaeda being as formidable as they are now. But I guess that doesn't matter. So far as politics goes, we also need to look at the link between interventionist foreign policy and the growth of terrorism as well. That's something for Western governments to think about quite clearly. This is reinforced by those with a history both in academia and the CIA, an example being Graham Fuller, for instance. Suffice it to say, I plan to tackle these subjects separately in the future, so do look out for that. For now, it seems clear to me that there's a problem with the way in which Muslims are treated and presented in the public sphere. Despite their best efforts, they're still largely ignored by the mainstream media. I'd like to hope this would change, because if it doesn't, you'll only see more of the same. Fear of minorities and those who capitalize on it. Thanks for watching. I'm interested to hear different opinions, so please let me know what you think in the comments. If you like this video, then please check out my Patreon page, where, for $1, you can help to make future videos possible. Ideally, I'd like to work on this channel full time, so any support would be appreciated. Please click the bell to get notified about new videos, and also to like and subscribe. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.